Protect my brothers and sisters, and thank you very much for this beautiful occasion. Yes, it is indeed true that Jews invented the Hamitic myth, whereby it was said that Ham, the son of Noah, was cursed in the book of Genesis. And somehow it was said that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, and that all Africans would be cursed and enslaved for time immemorial because of this so-called biblical curse on Ham. We now know that it was Jewish scholars who invented the story of the Hamitic myth, which has plagued black people from that point on. Yes, it is true, we now know that Jews were very importantly involved in the slave trade in medieval times, both, as Professor Clark has said, in the East, in the Arabic areas, and also in Europe. That is even before our African slave trade to the Americas. Yes, it is true, as we now know, the Jews were the ones who invented what came to be known as white slavery, whereby Jewish entrepreneurs in Europe in the late 19th century prostituted their own Jewish women, sent them around the world as prostitutes, what came to be known as white slavery. Yes, it is true, as we now know, the Jews were heavily invested in the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company, that company which was a private corporation doing the job of colonizing, which was responsible in large measure for the African slave trade. The Dutch West India Company that owned the Elmina Fort in what is now Ghana. The Dutch West India Company that brought slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, to South America. The same Dutch West India Company that brought the first slaves to New York, when it was still New Amsterdam. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that the Jews were the major element in the slave trade in Brazil in the 1600s, in Suriname, in Curacao, in Barbados, in Jamaica. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that the two largest single shipments of slaves coming into this country in the 18th century were on ships owned by Jews. It is true, as we now know, that Aaron Lopez, biggest slave ship owner in the United States of America, was a Jew. It is also true, as we now know, that all the rum distilleries in Newport, Rhode Island, in the era of the slave trade were owned by Jews. Rum, as we know, was a very important item in the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that there was a higher per capita ownership of slaves in the United States of America by Jews than by white Gentiles. We now know from the 1830 census of the US of A that something like 75% of Jewish households own slaves, as opposed to just 30-odd% for the white population as a whole. All of this information is contained in the secret relationship between blacks and Jews. And all of this information is based on the work of Jewish historians. So how come that we have a situation, an amazing situation developing here, where the Jewish leadership in this country is trying to deny the undeniable? And the only reason why the Jewish leadership has been able to place itself into this untenable and indefensible position, it seems to me, is because they have become drunk with power. They have gotten into the habit of easy victories over our people. Professor Clark said no more easy victories. They have won some easy victories in the past, and they have become so drunk with the power coming out of those easy victories, and have become so arrogant and so conceited that they have come to the point now where they believe that they can in fact defend the indefensible. The Jeffries case has shown that the time has come to an end, that from now on they will be forced to deal on an intellectual level with an aroused black community, and once we force them to deal on an intellectual level, the Jeffries case has shown, and I hope that my case will show, that they cannot win. Jewish power over black institutions in this country is based in large measure on the apparent liberalism of Jews in relation to black people in the 20th century. And what this book does, by showing the Jewish role in slavery and the slave trade, it punctures that balloon, that liberal balloon. It shows that Jews were in fact not a liberal community as far as black people were concerned for most of the history of Africans in America. And so as soon as that balloon is punctured, the whole apparatus of Jewish power over black people, which rests on this alleged Jewish liberalism, then becomes in a very perilous situation. And that, to my mind, partially explains the frenetic, crazy, insane way in which the Jewish community has tried to defend the indefensible by trying to deny their involvement in the African slave trade. Now, Jewish liberalism, like I said, is a 20th century phenomenon. Apparent Jewish liberalism is a 20th century phenomenon. Clearly, they weren't liberals during the slave trade if 75% of the Jewish households had slaves, and if they owned the largest shipments of slaves coming to this country, and if they owned all the rum distilleries in Newport, Rhode Island. The major initial apparently liberal activity of the Jewish population in relation to African Americans was in the formation of the NAACP in 1909. Much of that claim to liberalism lies in the fact that many major influential Jewish persons were among the founders of the NAACP. Some of the founders of the NAACP were not only prominent Jews, but were actually leaders of the American Zionist movement. You had the leaders of the American Zionist movement founding the NAACP. Could you imagine if Marcus Garvey had founded the ADL? Would anybody have taken Marcus Garvey seriously as a Pan-Africanist if he had founded the American Jewish Committee? They would instantly have looked at his motivation for so doing. Now we have discovered what the motivation is. Even as I speak, for the last 2 or 3 months, amazing revelations have been coming out in the press. Revelations suggesting that Joel Spingarn, the Jewish chairman of the NAACP, was actually spying on his own black NAACP membership, spying for US military intelligence. What kind of a liberal was that? Marcus Garvey, our most perceptive leader, Brother Ilombe was talking about race first, but this is amazing. Race first, as Ilombe said, was written 20 years ago as a PhD dissertation. But in race first, there's a quotation that goes something like this. And here Garvey is talking about white liberals. He didn't zero in on Jews per se, but he was talking about the white liberals in the NAACP, many of whom, as we know, were in fact Jews. And Garvey said that the white liberals were only about what he called disarming, disvisioning, and disambitioning the Negro, as he put it. He said that the white liberals were only about removing the African from the path of self-reliance and self-determination. And then Garvey went on to make a very significant statement. He said the liberals in the NAACP were nothing but spies. These are the exact words of Garvey, quote, spies for the rest of the white race, unquote. If one wants to really see the liberalism of the whites and Jews in the NAACP, one has to look not on the fact that they founded the NAACP, one has to look at their attitude towards Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In the UNIA, we had at the very same time the major organization in our history attempting to provide for us self-reliance and self-determination. And the white liberals, Jew and Gentile, in the NAACP targeted Marcus Garvey's effort at self-reliance as their major objective to attack. So here you find the real liberal agenda of the whites and Jews in the NAACP in the attitude to Marcus Garvey. The man, as has been said earlier, who sent Marcus Garvey to jail in his famous case in 1923 was Julian Mack. And Julian Mack wasn't only a Jew, he was also an influential member of the NAACP. At the beginning of the trial, Marcus Garvey and his lawyers asked Judge Mack to disqualify himself. Here was this man who was a member of the NAACP, which had been waging a campaign against Marcus Garvey, the Marcus Garvey must go campaign. Members of the very same NAACP had written, right around the time that Garvey was indicted, they had written a letter to the Attorney General of these United States, telling him that Garvey was a criminal, asking him to put Garvey in jail and or deport him. And here you had a representative of that very same organization sitting now in judgment over Marcus Garvey. And as Brother Ilombe said earlier, not only was Judge Mark a Jew, he was also a leader of the American Zionist movement. Over the years, many misguided people over the years have called Garvey a quote-unquote Negro Zionist. Nothing could be further from the truth. If Garvey was a quote-unquote Negro Zionist, then the Zionist judge would have let him off. You had a rare Zionist judge giving Garvey the highest possible fine, the longest possible term of imprisonment, and as if that wasn't enough, then charging him the entire costs of the trial, which was about 10 times the maximum fine. So that was a rare Zionist now dealing with the person who they call a Negro Zionist. And if you ever wanted any proof that there was nothing Zionist about Garvey's organization, here is the proof. During the Civil Rights Movement, especially the early phase of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, early 1960s, the Jewish claims to liberalism again came to the fore. The Jewish historians now tell us that something like 75%, they say, I have no reason to argue with them, they say that something like 75% of the funding for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, for SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they now tell us that something like 75% of the funding for those organizations in the 50s and early 60s was coming from Jewish sources. 75%. They're now telling us that Martin Luther King's most influential advisor was a Jewish man by the name of Stanley Levison. They're now telling us that Stanley Levison drafted Martin Luther King's speeches. I suspect he must have drafted his books as well, because if we look at Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, you find a very strange attack on what he calls black anti-Semitism. So it might very well be that Levison must have helped draft that book as well. We are now told that Levison was in charge of King's finances. We are now told that Levison was King's quote-unquote chief strategist. So here you had an incredible position of power and influence in the black civil rights movement. And much of what has happened in the last 20 years in Jewish-black relations can be explained around the question of that incredible power and influence which the major Jewish organizations had during the early phase of the black civil rights movement. Because what happened when the black power movement came into being in the middle of the 1960s was that the black power movement, without necessarily focusing on Jews per se, but the black power movement, just because it insisted on self-determination and self-reliance for black people, it began to look critically at the role of white people. And again, I'm not aware that the black power movement focused in on the white people as Jews, but they began to look at the role of alien people and the incredible influence which they had within our movement. And the black power movement, thanks to people like Carlos Cooks, people like Malcolm X, people like Stokely Carmichael, now Kwame Ture, H. Rap Brown, that whole generation, Assata Shakur, that whole generation, that black power generation began to say the time had come. As Marcus Garvey said in his famous essay on African fundamentalism, the time had come for us to take control over our own affairs. And so without necessarily targeting Jews as Jews, the black power movement, insofar as it expelled white people from the movement, automatically struck a very severe blow at that incredible Jewish power which had developed within the civil rights movement. And my suspicion is that once the Jewish establishment realized from the mid-60s on that they could no longer direct the black struggle from within, they seem to have taken a strategic decision that the next best thing was to try to destroy it from without. And so from the late 1960s on, you find a whole string of incidents bearing out my thesis. You had the Ocean Hill-Brownsville business back in 1968 in Brooklyn, where the Jewish teachers and the Jewish community generally destroyed the efforts of black parents to control the curriculum of their own schools, to control the education of their own children. You had the Baki case, among other cases. The Baki case is the most well-known of several court cases. In the Baki case, it was 1977, where you had a white man in California challenging the whole concept of quotas for black students in medical school. The case didn't involve Jews. The major Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, they inserted themselves into the case. The case didn't concern them. They voluntarily entered the case as so-called friends of the court to argue, to file briefs, and to argue against the concept of affirmative action quotas for black people. Here you had major Jewish organizations representing Jewish people who today are the recipients of perhaps the largest reparations in history. The Jewish state of Israel has received billions of dollars in reparations from Germany over the last few decades, billions of dollars. And here were black people struggling to maintain the absolute minimal reparations, a few quotas in medical school. And here were the recipients of the world's greatest reparations in history, entering into this Baki case to destroy even that little modicum of reparations that black people were getting via a few little extra places in medical school. You had the Dubé case, which Milombe mentioned earlier, at Stony Brook, where the South African professor gave his class a series of essays. One of the essays was Zionism as racism, which at the time was a very topical question. It was being debated. In fact, the United Nations, I believe, actually passed a resolution to that effect. It was a very topical academic issue at that point. All the man did was to insert this among a whole list of possible essay topics. The result, he lost his job. You had the case of Andrew Young in 1979, the darling of the integrationist, traditionally pro-Jewish establishment. And even Andrew Young fell victim to Jewish wrath in this period. Andrew Young was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Here was a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations trying to mediate a problem between Jews and Palestinians. And he decided, as any rational person would do, that the only way to mediate a problem between two people is to talk to both of them. He had a meeting with the PLO. The result was that he lost his job. Around the same time that Andrew Young had his meeting with the PLO, a Jewish U.S. ambassador to Austria, a man named Wolf, also met with the PLO. Did he lose his job? No, of course not. He was a Jew, he could do what he wanted. Andrew Young was judged by a different standard. He wasn't supposed to do what the Jews didn't like, even though the Jews could do what the Jews didn't like. But Andrew Young, as a black man, couldn't do what the Jews didn't like. You had the ongoing situation of Crown Heights. I recall, and I'm sure everybody here in this room is much more familiar than I am with the case. I think it was in the 70s where the young black man was killed by Jewish vigilantes in Crown Heights. Of course, we had the more recent situation in Crown Heights again over the last couple of years. Even Nelson Mandela was not exempt from Jewish wrath in this period. When Nelson Mandela came here to New York in 1990, on Ted Koppel's Nightline show, I distinctly recall Ted Koppel telling Nelson Mandela that he better go along with the Jewish agenda or risk losing support in America. And that in itself was a very revealing statement from Ted Koppel. Because what Koppel was saying in effect was that we Jews, he was saying, have the power in this country to deny you aid unless you go along with our agenda. That is what Koppel was in fact saying. It's not what he precisely articulated, but if you read between the lines, that is what he was saying. And Mandela, all praises due to him, had the courage, the strength to tell Ted Koppel on international TV, Mr. Koppel, he said, your enemies are not my enemies. By some strange coincidence, Jesse Jackson was sitting in the front seat as this exchange was going on between Ted Koppel and Mr. Mandela. And I remember sitting by my TV and looking intently at the face of Jesse Jackson and wondering what was going through his mind and if perhaps he was learning something he didn't know before, something about dignity and self-respect. Of course, Jesse himself is another example of this incredible Jewish onslaught against black folk for the last 20 years. In both of his presidential campaigns, Jesse Jackson was harassed by the Jewish community. In fact, the Jews became perhaps his largest single opponents during both of his campaigns. So my own case comes in that kind of a historical context. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of that context. Here I am using a book, a well-documented scholarly book, The Secret Relation Between Blacks and Jews, in my African American survey class, and somebody decides that black folk aren't supposed to use this book. For several months before I used the book, the organized Jewish leadership had been very assiduously and systematically attacking the book in the press. And all of us know how the Jewish establishment operates. By attacking the book, first they attacked the book, they called it anti-Semitic. Then they got a few Negro stooges to get up and attack the book too. And what they were doing was serving notice on all the other black professors out there, you all better not use this book, is what they were saying. Well, of course, I haven't been studying the Honorable Marcus Garvey for the last 20-odd years to let Jew or Gentile tell me which book is appropriate for my class. And so, naturally, I paid no heed to their warning. One of the Jewish newspapers, I believe it was the New York Forward newspaper, published by the Jewish community, after my situation arose, they had an article in there in which they said that I was defiant, quote unquote defiant. They called me defiant. And that too is very, very illustrative of what's really going on here. That proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that what they had done, their strategy was to tell black folk preemptively, as we say in Trinidad, from in front, not to use that book. So by my using the book, I was defiant. Who the hell are these Jews to tell me that I am defiant? They're not my mother, they're not my father. Defiant hell. The very term is so redolent of arrogance. Defiant. In other words, I am not supposed to use the book unless I get their permission, and having used the book in spite of the lack of permission, I was therefore being defiant. Can you imagine that? I was being defiant. My situation, I believe, is a very fascinating situation as a historian on the one hand, and also the person in the middle of it on the other hand. It gives me a very unique perspective on this whole situation, because as a historian, I can stand back and look at the situation objectively, almost as though I'm not the one involved, as though somebody else over there. I can stand back and look at it through the perspective of a historian, and see it in context, historical context. Of course, as the person involved in it, I get a very intimate feel for the Jewish tactics in these kinds of areas. And so it seems to me that my situation has illuminated, for me at least, many of the basic principles upon which the Jewish onslaught has been practiced over the last couple of decades or more. First of all, there's their incredible arrogance. In my case, you had two students from the Hillel organization, which is the student arm of the ADL. Clearly, they had been primed by their superiors that this book was anti-Semitic, quote unquote. They came and sat in my class the first day of the semester, unknown to me. An incredibly arrogant thing. The students then did what their elders have always done. It's very interesting. when the Jewish establishment moves on you, they move straight to whoever they perceive to be your superiors. In this case, the Jewish students who had learned very well from the elders, they went straight to the president and the dean of the college. They never talked to me. They went straight to the president and the dean. The president sent them to the chairman of the department. The chairman sent them to me. That's when they came to me. Only when they couldn't deal at any other level did they come to me. The Jewish organization has waged a struggle against us over the last several decades, also because of its great influence in the media. And here again, my case illustrated this. You had 4 Jewish organizations getting together: the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Community Relations Council. 4 Jewish organizations got together and issued a joint press release against me, poor little me, saying I was anti-Semitic and bigoted, etc. I have a copy of the actual press release, and it's the most amazing press release I've ever seen, and I've seen many press releases in my time. This press release is on a piece of paper this big. It has the logos of all 4 organizations across the top. It has the signatures of the various executives of each organization. The piece of paper is so big that I liken it to a medieval scroll. I'm sure in the movies you've seen those medieval scrolls where King Arthur and the rest of them, so one of the knights at the round table would come to King Arthur and he would roll out this big long proclamation. Well, this is the proclamation they issued against me. They actually went on record as saying that it's the first time that 4 of the organizations ever got together to issue a single press release against a single individual. And the question, why is this overkill? And again, the reason has to be because they see a loss of power over black people. They vamped on Dr. Jeffries. As soon as they figured, well, Dr. Jeffries was, in the throes of struggle, somebody else popped up at his side. They're getting to the point now where there are no more easy victories. In fact, where there are no victories at all. For the first time, they are at the point where we are beginning to win victories. And this makes them not only frantic and frenetic, but it almost makes them lose their mind. It pushes them into situations where they can't win. In both Dr. Jeffrey's situation and in my situation, they have gotten themselves into fights that they cannot win. They can't possibly win. And only a fool picks a fight that he can't win. And the only explanation for this is the great loss of power and that frantic desire to maintain what little power they have left, but they see it slipping away. History is moving against them, and they are beginning to act irrationally. And in that lack of rational action, of course, we have our opportunity. In my case, too, I saw the tendency, the ability, the historical ability of the Jewish leadership to resort to lies and distortions. The Boston Globe published 4 articles against me, including an editorial, in 6 days. And it was a great learning experience for my students, because here, luckily the class was still in session. So here we had students, I had a whole class full of students who had actually read this book, who knew what the issues were, and I was able to, bring these articles and show the students, And the students could see for themselves the lies and distortions. They were seeing things written in a paper, in an editorial. It was just totally devoid of any truth. One of the greatest distortions which has been manufactured around this particular case is that the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, alleges, they say, the Jews were genetically disposed towards slave owning. A couple nights ago, Ted Koppel, before Ted Koppel got into the little Wellesley section, by the way, Koppel's people, not Koppel himself, interviewed me for something like 30 minutes in my office, but only about 2 seconds got onto that show. And they made sure they prefaced that 2 seconds by saying, Tony Martin is teaching this book that says that Jews are genetically disposed towards slavery. Then they gave me my little 2-minute clip. Of course, I had no means of responding in that type of situation. And that is a prime example of the resort to lies and distortions. Absolutely shameless. Another mode of operation of the Jewish leadership, which my case illustrates, is their shameless use of the Uncle Tom element within our race. Practically every single article that has been published on my situation in the Jewish press, and many of those in the non-ostensibly Jewish press, almost every single article has quoted Paul Skip Gates. If I was Skip Gates by this time, I would be just sick and tired of being quoted. Or as Skip Gates says, or the great Harvard University professor said, Skip Gates is not a historian, never wrote a history book in his life. He wrote, an op-ed in the New York Times about a book that showed no evidence that he had ever read the book. But the fact is that he has offered himself up to be used in this way. On my own campus, we have some of this element who are also falling over themselves in their rush to also offer themselves up in the hope, I presume, that they too will be rewarded as Skip Gates has been rewarded with fame and fortune. Another element of the tactics of the Jewish organizations, which my case illustrates, is their tendency to suppress free speech. They operate in the name of free speech, but they in fact suppress free speech. The question is free speech for the Jews and their Uncle Toms, stooges, and everybody else, if possible, is to be excluded from the media. We saw it on the Ted Koppel show, like I said, they biased the segment dealing with Wellesley, and of course I had no opportunity to respond. The Boston Globe, as I said, wrote an editorial attacking me. I wrote a letter responding. They refused to publish it. Even my very school newspaper refused to publish my response to all of the Jewish allegations. The school newspaper also refused to publish a black student's response to the allegations of the Jews. We also see in my case the tendency of the Jewish organizations to resort to dirty tricks. I discovered just 2 days ago that the Hillel organization on my campus has sent a packet of information to the parents of black students on my campus. A packet of information very prejudicial to me. Of course I will respond. I have the ability to respond, and I will respond. But it just goes to show the level of dirty tricks that these organizations will resort to. Perhaps the most important element of the Jewish tactics, which my case illustrates, is the tendency of these Jewish organizations, where they disagree with anyone, to go for the person's economic livelihood. Dubé lost his job at Stony Brook. Andrew Young lost his job at the United Nations. Many black principals and teachers lost their jobs when the Ocean Hill Brownsville thing went down. They removed Professor Jeffries from the chairmanship of the Black Studies Department at City College. In the press release which the 4 Jewish organizations put out against me, they called upon Wellesley College to fire me. Imagine that. They claimed, they asked Wellesley College to quote unquote review my tenure. In other words, they didn't like my perspective, so I'm supposed to be fired for using a book that tells the truth because they don't like the truth when it concerns them. Fortunately for us, like I said, the tide is turning. History is running against the Jewish leadership and their onslaught and their oppression, their manipulation of our movement for the last several decades. It is moving against them because we have an aroused population. We are in the midst of a black books revolution whereby our people, for the first time in our history, are now able to write books, publish them, distribute them, sell them, without going through any Jew or Gentile distributors. The power of the ability to publish their own material was very well demonstrated in my little broadside. Here was a broadside, just a little 4-page broadside. But I had the means, I had the ability, I had the experience, I had the know-how to publish several thousands of these broadsides and spread them around the country, get them directly into the hands of my people. And I was very heartened by the response of black people in this country. Everywhere the broadside went, people took it upon themselves to run off copies. A brother in Chicago told me he ran off several hundred copies. He went to a rally against Mayor Daley there and was just handing them out in the street. A brother in Montreal told me he ran off some hundreds of copies. Another brother in Chicago ran off hundreds of copies. A brother in Washington, D.C. told me he ran off hundreds of copies. And interestingly enough, when the 4 Jewish organizations got together and issued their press release against me, at that point they said in the press release that the book was no longer a problem. They said the broadside was a problem now. After having attacked me for 3 weeks for teaching the book, when the broadside came out, that blew their minds to such an extent that this great medieval scroll of a press release was put out, an unprecedented thing. 4 organizations, same press release. They called the broadside the most anti-Semitic thing they'd ever seen on a college campus. There was nothing anti-Semitic about the broadside. What they meant by anti-Semitic was that for the first time in a long time they saw a document which in a very articulate, succinct, direct and clear fashion exposed the role of the Jewish establishment in the black struggle for the last several decades. In other words, the truth was now presented in a way that could easily be assimilated by large numbers of people. The word was getting out. It did not go through Jewish distributors. There was no way they could prevent it getting out. And so, amazingly enough, I actually debated one of the leaders of the American Jewish Committee the other night on radio in Boston, and he was actually saying, oh, Tony Martin can teach whatever he wants, we don't, deny his right to teach the secret relationship, but the broadside. So if the broadside could cause this amount of trouble, just imagine the kind of problems they will have at the end of the summer when hopefully I will finish writing my book on the Jewish question. I'm going to call it the Jewish question, a black perspective. Dealing with the Jews for the last 2 months has made me an expert. An expert on the Jewish question. So I say in conclusion, I say like Brother Ilombe said, we're not going to back off this one. We're not going to back off from this point on. Let the Jeffries case be the first in a string of victories for African people in this country. As Professor Clark said, there must be no more easy victories for the Jews. There must be no victories at all for the Jews. This is the beginning of our victories. And so thank you very much again for this wonderful occasion. One God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you.